When I'm making a film, I try as much as I am able to allow the truth to come through.
I'm completely honored today to have Olivia Lichtenstein in conversation. Olivia is a recognized, celebrated, award-winning documentary filmmaker and a published author. Over the course of her career, she's produced or directed numerous feature-length documentaries and documentary series television episodes. She's published not one but 2 novels, and now is training to be a psychotherapist. A move that she tells us is not altogether uncommon among documentarians. And she'll tell us why.
I think that the job of the documentary filmmaker is to try and represent reality with as little bias as possible and to allow their subjects to tell their story.
It all began in an unexpected place. A unique year spent studying abroad in the Soviet Union at perhaps the height of the Cold War. Olivia moved from Leningrad to Los Angeles, where she joined ABC News, and then the BBC. The theme here is stories, uncovering them, telling them, and ultimately writing our own. This episode is full of insights about layering experiences in order to build a durable and multifaceted career. All this to say, you are in for a fascinating conversation about how films and careers can unfold in the most unexpected of ways. Tremendous thanks are due to Olivia Lichtenstein for elevating this podcast and for demonstrating how telling other people's stories can help us write our own.
Hello, I'm Olivia Lichtenstein. I'm a documentary filmmaker and writer, and I'm actually currently training to be a psychotherapist. I've been making films and working in television for about the past 40 years and came to it from being a Russian studies graduate, which is probably a relatively unusual path, but I think in those days actually people didn't go to film school. You did other things and then found your way into broadcasting.
If you would, take us back to that time period. Where were you studying and what was the environment like?
I went to university in the mid-1970s. I was at Sussex University. So it was very much at the height of the Cold War, with Brezhnev still in power in Russia. And anything to do with the Soviet Union treated as something sort of fearful and dark, and this whole notion of the Iron Curtain, this place that you went behind. And it was really very different. And I spent a year at Leningrad University, and it was absolutely fascinating, actually, because it was such a different world. And I remember that people used to always sort of say to me, are you a spy? Which just shows you the kind of not there, but sort of hit, in the West. When I said I was studying Russian, they'd ask if I was a spy. And actually, a lot of people that I studied with and who were studying at other universities were, in fact, approached by the British intelligence services. And I always felt rather offended that I wasn't. And I think it may have been to do with the fact that I was born in South Africa to very politically active parents. And was Jewish, and I don't think that those are necessarily the right credentials for the British intelligence service. And I then went on to UCLA for a year as a Fulbright scholar, where I did my master's.
Again in Russian studies?
Again, Slavic languages and literatures. And actually, it was around that point that I suddenly had this kind of epiphany and thought, well, obviously I must work in television. And I don't even know why I thought that, but I just somehow, I think, realized that would be the kind of right environment for me, and that I'd always been interested in telling stories. And so actually my first job when I came back to the UK, I got a job at ABC News in their London bureau when Peter Jennings was the anchor.
I remember. So I wonder, because I'm fascinated on how people's personal stories can translate into careers. So you're born in South Africa. What age did you move to the UK?
I moved to the UK when I was 7. We moved from South Africa actually to what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And then my father got into trouble because he was very anti-apartheid and very prominent and was actually the first white member of Joshua Nkomo's party. And so staying there sort of became untenable. And so we then moved to London, which was actually where a lot of, they tended to be Jewish actually, these sort of white South African activists. And so there was a kind of enclave of these people in the early 60s in London.
So you've grown up surrounded by political activism, equality. You come to the UK, completely different environment, culture, weather, and then you find your way to studying Russian studies. What was that connection? What inspired? Because correct me if I'm wrong, in the UK, university studies actually have to be chosen earlier than they do in other places like the US. So what was the connection to Russia?
Well, no, that's all absolutely true. And I think that, when you come from that kind of a background, you never kind of belong anywhere. You don't really fit in. So you always have this sort of outsider status. And I think on top of that, being Jewish, where you're part of a diaspora that's kind of scattered across the world. So, my parents were born in South Africa, but their parents weren't. And I had a kind of consciousness that my grandparents had come from Russia, Lithuania, and Latvia. And I liked learning languages and I was good at it. And I went to a school where Russian was offered. And so I had the opportunity to start studying it when I was 13. And I had a wonderful Russian teacher. And I had a great love of reading from an incredibly young age. And so then being introduced to Russian literature, I kind of fell in love with that and felt that this was something that I wanted to study. And I think also because it is a difficult, complex language, by the time I'd done A-level, I felt, well, I don't think I speak this well enough to stop learning it. So I think I better go on with it. So it was quite kind of arbitrary in that sense. It was really just because I loved it.
So you say arbitrary, but you can see the connections as you're speaking between a feeling of belonging or lack thereof, a love of reading, and a love of literature. Really briefly, because I know this could be the topic of its own chat, what is it about Russian literature that is so different and so attractive throughout the centuries to readers?
I think actually that it is so deeply psychological and that is the attraction because it speaks to the whole issue of what it is to be a human being and the human condition. And if you look at people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, it's especially, I think now that I'm doing my psychotherapy training somehow, I can really see the way that it's an exploration of the human mind, and an examination of life and the way that people behave. And I think it was that probably captured my imagination.
That makes perfect sense. So A levels come and go. It's decided that you know what, I don't speak this language well enough. I must continue. And then what's that like? It's the 1970s, as you said. It's in many ways the height of the Cold War. It's also a tender moment in British history. The British economy is going through a lot of changes as well. I wonder if that was part of or informed any of your studies or stuff that was going on campus.
I think probably that in a sense that there was. I think there's something about sometimes when you're young you're blissfully ignorant about what's going on around you in that sense, and you kind of get used to the fact that there's a 3-day week and that you go home and light candles to do your homework and that sort of stuff. But I think there was probably a sense in which one was looking at other societies to see whether there were other ways of living and whether there were other systems that perhaps worked better, that felt more egalitarian. But I have to say, I think any notion of that was probably dispelled by a long stint in the Soviet Union, because you really got to know how deeply unhappy many people were and what a repressive system it was. Which is not to say that there weren't some good things about it, because there were. But I suppose it's interesting when you think back to that time, and also when you think of sort of what's happening now and how kind of end of days everything feels, because there was always that perception by the Soviet Union that, we lived in this sort of decadent, rotting society. And it does feel a bit like that at the moment, I guess.
I'm curious about the culture shock, if there was one, and it sounds like there was in that year in Leningrad. What was that like? How old were you exactly, actually, and where did you live? What did you study? Were there any other classmates from the UK there?
So I went on what was a British Council cultural exchange, and I was housed in a hostel which was for Soviet postgraduates and students from capitalist countries. And it always amused us to be defined as such, because that certainly wasn't how we defined ourselves. And so we shared a room. You had to share a room with a Soviet student, And of course, quickly love affairs blossomed all over the hostel. And so I think after the initial kind of shock of it all, because it was very different, but it was like the most incredibly exciting adventure. And, I fell madly in love with a Russian mathematician from Siberia who I nearly married. I was 22 when I went, so pretty young. And I did nearly marry this guy. And then I suddenly thought, oh God, I'm 22. What am I doing? And how will I feel when I go back to England? And how can I be responsible for this man who doesn't speak any English at all? And I kind of chickened out, which was probably quite wise. But there were a lot of these sort of marriages, actually. So it was sort of quite a heady time because you were far from home and contact was difficult. So if you wanted to sort of phone home, it would take days. You'd have to go to the post office and order a telephone call and then go back at the allotted time. And so you really were quite cut off. So there were some other students there who were from British universities as well, and obviously strong friendships were made amongst them. But I think we all quite quickly really integrated ourselves into Russian life and met lots of people. And culturally, it was fantastic because of the times. Access to things like ballet and opera and theatre and all that kind of stuff was incredibly cheap. And so I saw the whole repertoire of the Kirov ballet and, spent days in the Hermitage. And so, in that sense, it was a really rich experience. So while you were living on kind of black bread and boiled eggs, you were able to feed your soul, which felt like a very Russian thing to do.
Oh, that is, and that is a very beautiful way of putting it as well. So the year concludes, you move back to England, and then possibly in the 1970s, maybe the most opposite place that could exist from Leningrad, it sounds like, LA. What was that like? And I'm sure, or what were the flashbacks like when you were studying in Los Angeles to your time in the Soviet Union?
I was aware at the time that I was going from the sort of sublime to the ridiculous, and I felt that it would be a very good sort of counterpoint. And I had never been to America at that point. And after I graduated from Sussex, I went on a trip to stay with my godparents who lived in LA. And I sort of sauntered onto campus and just made my way to the Slavic department and chatted to them. And they said, why don't you come and do a master's? And I think about it, I was so casual and without any plan. And I didn't really know what to do next. And I just thought, oh, okay, maybe I'll do that. So I then applied for the Fulbright scholarship. And when I got it, it felt like the die had been cast. So I went back to LA. And actually, I have to say, at first, I didn't like it very much. I found that actually the reaction to what I was studying in America was even more sort of negative and marked than it was certainly in the UK. And so everyone was sort of asking me if I was a communist the whole time. Felt like living in the McCarthy era. And so I was having to sort of account for myself. And I was also surrounded by people who wanted to be lawyers so they could make a lot of money. And so I found a bit distasteful, having, I suppose, grown up in London and then had this big Russian experience. But I did settle down and then did enjoy it. And I think, for me, the weather was wonderful and reminded me of my African childhood. And so I think there was that sense in which I felt very comfortable there. Somehow the environment, the physical environment suited me very well. But actually, I did my master's, it was normally a 2-year course, but I did it in a year because I felt it was sort of time to get on and get a job. So yeah, it did feel like I'd had these very extreme, different experiences, but they felt sort of important and significant, and I think that it helped me with a sort of something which became very useful in my career afterwards, which was that ability to fit in wherever I was, kind of to be kind of chameleon that you could shape shift and make it work.
And of course, being the home of film, I know your background is documentary film, not narrative film, but was that part of it too? Were you exposed to, whether it was television or movies, did this inform the next stage of your career, your time in LA?
I'm not sure that it did consciously, but I think that you're right in the sense that it so permeated the atmosphere. And, I remember you would sort of see people everywhere. I remember sort of pulling up at traffic lights next to Walter Matthau and, weird things like that. And I also would go to recordings of TV shows for some reason. And so I think that even though it wasn't conscious, I think there was probably something going on that was kind of, by some sort of process of osmosis getting into me.
Thus begins your career in the news.
I got a job at ABC News as a production assistant, which was quite sort of administrative, but I had this kind of sense that I was paying my dues. And I had to do, order up the satellite and order the cabs for the correspondence, pretty low-level stuff. But it was a very busy time in terms of news because there was everything that was happening in Poland at the time with Lech Wałęsa and, that sort of liberation of Poland and the Falklands War. And so very quickly I was promoted to foreign news desk editor, which sounds rather glamorous, but also was really just kind of keeping on top of breaking news stories and assigning crews and phoning people up in the middle of the night and telling them that they needed to get on a plane to Beirut and that kind of thing. But because it was quite a small outfit, and so actually there was a lot of opportunity to sort of, do research and really be in the mix. And it was an exciting time, and it was a time when you could learn an awful lot. And I quickly found that I very much enjoyed hanging out in the edit and watching as, the stories were put together. And it felt it was such a weird thing. I suppose felt very logical to me that this was a very good way of telling a story. And I suppose, I'd written all my life and I'd had to write academically. And it seemed to me that the addition of pictures was a very good way of communicating. Yeah, and of storytelling, for sure.
So this time in the edit suite informs your move from, let's call it reporting to storytelling.
Yeah, but first, in fact, I actually was an on-screen reporter for a while.
Oh, right.
And that was fun. But again, what I liked was that, shooting, because it was great because it was when TVAM, which was the first breakfast television in the UK, and it was when that started. And so you were very much responsible. You were really thrown in the deep end and you were just sent out with a crew and had to kind of get on with it and come back with your material, cut it together, write your script, voice it, put it on the air. And so it was a real baptism by fire.
Oh, right.
And fantastic experience because also having to do something in a couple of minutes, there's always that joke, isn't there? Is it about Pascal, the French writer, who says something like, "I'm sorry, I'm writing you a long letter. I haven't got time to write a short one." And there is something about that kind of brevity where you have to really, it's really good training. So, so I spent sort of a year doing that. And then actually got a call from the BBC saying that they were wanting to do a big documentary series in the Soviet Union. And a couple of people had mentioned me to them and that I spoke Russian. And so the Russian paid off in the end. So I then joined the BBC.
And so your role at the BBC when you joined was what exactly?
So I joined the BBC as assistant producer, so where primarily your job is to do the research, and because I was the language speaker, I did all the interviews, and I had the most wonderful boss there who was the series producer. And at the BBC, you were called producers, but you were directors as well. You were producer directors. And my boss there was a man called Richard Denton, who to this day is one of my dearest friends. And he was really my mentor. And I completely sort of, pumped him for information. And he was a very generous teacher. And he then let me produce and direct 3 of the films in that series.
And what was the series again?
So the series was called Comrades, and it was portraits of Soviet life. And what we did was there were 12 films, and each one profiled a different citizen of the Soviet Union. And Richard and I had this kind of spreadsheet where we were sort of cross-checking everything to try and get as much kind of content and as much sort of difference, both geographical and socially and professionally. So we had, a film director from Leningrad, an eye surgeon from Moscow, a fashion designer from Tallinn, footballers from Azerbaijan, hunters from Siberia. And each film followed the life of one of those individuals or groups of individuals to build up a picture of what life was like in the Soviet Union at that time.
And how was the series received here in the UK?
Well, it was interesting, actually. So it was a very kind of, it was the first time that there had been a series of this nature made inside the Soviet Union. So it had an enormous profile. I think that there was a kind of backlash where quite a lot of the British press sort of accused us of having been kind of duped by the Soviets, because of course it's still, a pretty antagonistic era. But generally, it was very well received. And I think that, in a way, our ambition was quite modest, really. What we wanted to do was show that people are people, wherever they live and under whatever system, and to kind of appeal to the sort of common humanity in everyone. And I think we really did succeed in doing that. It's interesting because it is one of those series that people do still remember, because it was really the first time people had a proper look behind the Iron Curtain.
Mm-hmm. You're segueing into basically exactly what I wanted to ask, which was, this question is going to sound basic, but I wonder if you could define for us what a documentary film is. How is it different in your experience, but also in general terms from just the news? What makes a documentary in your view?
Oof, gosh, I suppose that's a difficult one. I mean, I suppose that there's always goes back to this sort of Reithian values of kind of entertaining and informing. I think that the job of the documentary filmmaker is to try and represent reality with as little bias as possible, and to allow their subjects to tell their story. Now, obviously, there are so many stages along the way of that are complicated, because by dint of the fact that you film what you film and you edit what you edit, there's always going to be a kind of filter that things are going through. But I think certainly, from my perspective, when I'm making a film, I try as much as I am able to allow the truth to come through. And that often you can start off with an idea for a film, and in the course of it, you may find that your kind of preconceptions are incorrect. And I think it's about then having the ability to sort of ditch those and allow the film to be what it needs to be, and to tell the story that needs to be told. And this all sounds rather sort of elusive, but you do get this sense of a kind of deep truth that needs to be told, and that it's your job somehow to be the midwife for that.
I'm struck by some of the parallels that we have to news and journalism and reporting today in terms of the truth. And I'm also reminded of a quote that I read recently, that there can never be complete absence of bias, because as soon as you have an edit point, even just one, that's a human opinion or decision or choice. And so that notion of truth and intention and storytelling is in some ways, I think, a constant, something that can never be satisfactorily or summarily answered. There will always be an edit, there will always be some sort of bias, however unintentional or even subconscious. Does that sound right?
Yes, I mean, I think that is true. And I think it's foolish to deny that. But I think that it's a consciousness of that is important, and an awareness of it. And also that you question yourself when you're doing something, and sort of, try and interrogate whether you are doing it for the purest of intentions, and whether the edit is actually serving the truth that you're trying to tell.
I'm interested in something else that you said, which was the way that biases or preconceived notions can melt away as the project unfolds. But I wonder if you could go a little bit more prosaic and explain, or pull the curtain back, as I like to say, on the process. How scripted are documentaries? Is there a thesis or a conclusion? What is that whole process like?
I think there's a great difference between, what are called documentaries these days. So let's just be clear that reality shows aren't documentaries.
Yes.
So I was brought up in the documentary department at the BBC, which I think made the best documentaries at the time. And we were so purist there that if we wanted to film someone waking up in the morning, we would arrange to creep into their bedroom while they were still sleeping, in order to absolutely truthfully film them as they woke up. I don't think many people do that these days, but those were the kind of principles that we adhered to. So I would never tell someone what to talk about or set anything up. And if you missed a shot, you missed a shot, and that was that. I think things are very different these days, but I feel you can always see that kind of fakery. And actually, it's those moments which happen spontaneously in front of your camera that you always, even as you're filming them, know are going to end up in the final cut, because they're so authentic. So that what one's striving for is authenticity at all times. I mean, to give a concrete example of how much you know in the beginning, I made a film about American women on death row. And my boss at the time said, oh, go and have a look at this. Why are these women on death row? What's going on? So I thought, oh, well, okay, I'm going to kind of make this film and just look at this variety of reasons why these women are on death row. And what I quickly discovered was that most of the women were there for having killed their abusive partners or husbands. And I remember going back to my boss and saying, okay, it's not just about death row, that's not the story. The story is about domestic violence and what it leads to and the way that it wasn't at the time allowed as a defence. And so I made a film which was called Why Women Kill. And it was about that, and it was very powerful, and it was happening just at the time, actually, where in the UK, domestic violence was being allowed to be used as a defence in the courtroom. The facts inform you. They tell you what the story is and what you need to be doing. But sometimes you do have a really clear notion. So I made a film about the American soul singer Teddy Pendergrass recently, a feature-length documentary. And in order to raise the finance for it, I made a sizzle. And then at the end, I think I was teaching a class at an American college, and I showed that sizzle. And I said, it's so weird. I haven't looked at this for 3 years, but actually that is exactly the film I made. So I obviously for that one, I had a very clear sense of a 3-act film. And even though I'd gone around the houses on it in the edit, actually it had come back and had been that film because that was the story, So I do think, and it sounds pretentious, but there's a sense in which you have to find the sculpture in the stone, and it is there waiting for you.
And a sizzle, just to define, that's the sizzle film. That's like a trailer before you make it to give people the tone and
the taste and the sense of the story. Exactly.
It does feel like a bit of a mysterious industry from the outside looking in, because there's so many different genres: true crime, historical, musical, as you've said, nature. Many are made for television, others are made with a theatrical release in mind. As a filmmaker yourself, you have crossed genres. How common is that?
Probably more common these days. I think it was always difficult because I've also directed drama, so I think that was always a difficult transition to make from documentary to drama and the other way around. And I've written novels as well, and I think that people always express surprise about that. But what I would say is that it's all storytelling. It's kind of all the same job. It's just like you're using different tools, slightly different medium in which to do it. But ultimately, it's about telling a story. So I think the question is, what's the best way to tell this story? You can be much more complex in print than you can in making a documentary, for example, because when you're writing, you can say things in parentheses, you can have a little aside, you can wander off down a leafy lane. And when you're making a film, you can't do that somehow because there's a sort of directness that's required to keep the audience on board and keep them with you.
Moving off on too much of a tangent in film can feel or is distracting. It can backfire, right? Whereas in written format, whether it's a novel or a nonfiction book, those detours are sometimes a welcome stroll down a leafy lane, as you put it in that lovely metaphor. Why is that? Why is in film it's unwelcome?
I think it just becomes confusing in film. You don't know who you're meant to be following. You don't quite know where your focus is meant to be. I had a bit of a sort of side issue in my Teddy Pendergrass film because there was a fascinating case of a manager that he had who used to be his girlfriend, and she was murdered. And I felt it was too interesting a story not to tell. So I did wander off the path and tell it for a bit, which I was tempted to go much further down, which was all about sort of gangster life in Philadelphia in the 1970s. But, I then sort of realized, no, this is a whole other story and I can't go there now. And so I allowed myself a little bit of a peregrination, but then had to come back on track.
That's a really interesting and very simple and valuable point. You're also perfectly segueing into one of the next things I wanted to ask, which was about timings. Let's take the most recent film that you just described. How long did that take from original kernel of idea through to distribution?
The Teddy Pendergrass film took 4 years. And, it's a long time. I just produced a film directed by some John O'Macleod, which is currently out, called My Old School. We started on that, Jono and I, in 2017. So that one was 5 years. These are feature-length documentaries, so that takes much longer because the whole business of raising the money takes a long time. And obviously, at the beginning stages, it's not something that you're doing absolutely full-time because, you're writing the treatment, you'll be making a sizzle, you'll be having meetings, endlessly trying to get the money together. But that's very lengthy. If you're doing something that has been commissioned by a broadcaster, the process will be a whole lot quicker because you'll get the budget in place. And normally, to make an hour-long documentary would be probably about 16 to 20 weeks. Yeah, so that's much faster. But, again, it depends also on the nature of the film. If it's something that you're wanting to follow over time, to get that kind of narrative development, then so there's no hard and fast rule, to be honest. It can be done quickly if it's containable and easy to do so, and it can take a long time as well.
And financing, of course, can also take a long time.
Mm.
Are there any typical financiers, or in today's day and age, a financier could be a traditional film finance company or a private individual who has a particular interest in a topic? Is that the case?
Totally. There are so many ways to skin that particular cat, so that you can get some private finance, some from a broadcaster, or you can try and sort of make it yourself and then put it out at a festival and then attract buyers that way. Ultimately, the simpler it is, then the better, because then you have less masters to serve. But, this is film financing. Seminars are constantly on the go for wannabe filmmakers to try and crack the code. And actually, the truth of the matter is that there's no one simple answer. There's just so many different ways you can do it.
And it sounds like you've probably done it a number of these ways, obviously having worked for the BBC with the budget in place, and with the most recent Teddy Pendergrass film, having raised the money yourself. From your own personal experience, is there a best?
I suppose that another film that I produced recently, which was called The Last Mountain, that was really nice and sort of straightforward because we had BBC TV and Universal Pictures. And so we had them in place, and that was fantastic. And then we could just get on with it and make the film.
Right. And those sound like two extremely experienced financiers and partners.
Exactly.
And then what about, as you mentioned before, your multiple masters, creative differences, or what you hear about perhaps more in narrative films than in documentaries, but fights over the final edit. Has that been something you've experienced?
I think I have been fortunate. I haven't had too bad of a time of it on that front. There can sometimes be, notes that you get which irritate you. And sometimes it's a way of, you have to sort of find an accommodation. I think what I've often found is that quite often people will say something about, say, a particular part of the film and suggest a solution. And it often is that the solution's not correct because they don't know the film as well as you do, but they have pinpointed that there's a problem at that point. And so I think I often sort of say, okay, let's just look at the problem and we'll find our own solution to it. And actually 9 times out of 10, when you do that, it's fine and it addresses the issue. I think there is a problem these days with an awful lot of people being involved and there being too many sets of notes, which is not something that used to happen in the past. But in my own experience, I can only say I think I've been quite fortunate. I don't think I've ever really had to put anything out that I have felt I've compromised my vision on.
That's good to hear. And I especially love that, let's call it a hack, when a particular note is given. Okay, that's the answer, one answer, but let's focus perhaps on the problem, because there can be more than one. And I'm struck by that being like just a very effective way of perhaps addressing answers that we might not agree with, that could apply obviously outside of film as well. I'm very curious in your career shift as well, but just a few more questions, if I may, on filmmaking, and that's the role of technology, because your career obviously spans a nice range of when, as you put it, you were phoning people up and getting satellites set, and now, of course, the immediacy of information. What are some of the biggest ways that you think that technology has affected from your first film to your most recent?
Wow, it's been such a change, as you rightly say. So when I started out, making documentaries, we were shooting on 16mm film. So that is as different as it can be from what goes on these days. But, I'm really grateful that I did that because it taught you an incredibly important discipline. Film was so expensive. It was about £150 for a 10-minute can of film. And so you had to be really disciplined about what you rolled on. And we used to try, work on a ratio of about 15 to 1, actually, 15 minutes to 1 minute of cut material. It meant that you had to think really carefully about a sequence that you were filming or something that you wanted to film in terms of how it was going to end up in your film. And I think that what's happened with later generations is because they can sort of spray everywhere, what's happened is that you end up with such an enormous quantity of film in the cutting room that it takes a long time to wade through it and find the shape of something. So it was a good discipline. And often what we would do would be, well, we'd start to roll on sound before we'd even turn the camera on, because you knew that if you had the sound, you could always find some pictures to make it work. And so you'd go, okay, let's roll on sound. And then suddenly you would hot up, and then you'd look at your cameraman and go, turn over. I suppose it sort of, it kind of disciplined your mind in a way. And I think also in the edit, it felt like a much more tangible thing, so that, you'd go, oh, look, just give me a little bit more. And you would mean that, because you'd mean a few frames, which literally would be that little bit. And you'd have these, your shots hanging up in the trim bin. And so you had a very sort of spatial awareness somehow of the film that you were creating and the length of a shot, which people don't have nowadays in that sense, because it's all digital. And I remember filming covertly in the Soviet Union when I was making a film about prostitution. And just to show you in a way how clunky the technology was at that stage, we had a film camera hidden inside a briefcase which had a hole cut out of it on the side, which we would sort of strategically place to do this covert filming. And it worked, it was really good, it worked really well. But of course, nowadays, all of that capture is so much easier, and there's great advantage to that as well. So I wouldn't naysay what's happened, but I feel very lucky to have been on that journey, because I think there's a kind of richness in it. But it then became very exciting, when all the GoPros came along, and when you could do multi-camera on a because we were always single camera. But now, for example, if I'm making a film and I'm doing an interview, I'll usually have two cameras, because why wouldn't you?
Right. That makes it easier to edit conversations. Is that right? You can jump back and forth.
Absolutely. Without having to cut away to something, you can just cut to another angle. And keep that kind of flow going somehow. So there's lots of advantages too.
It sounds like the scarcity sharpened the sensibilities of everybody.
Yes, I think it gave you focus.
Yeah, which is a nice and an interesting lesson. Two more questions about technology in the future. One is the rise of streaming services seems to have given rise to an explosion in documentary films of all kinds, not just the reality shows that you mentioned, which I know are not documentaries, but all sorts of true crime exposés and music documentaries. Is there a reason behind that? In other words, did you have a topic or a genre that between your time at the BBC or in conversations with the financiers, there just seemed to be more demand for than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is very audience driven. So, in my latter years at the BBC, I was the editor of a documentary strand called Inside Story, and I commissioned single films. And I think I probably commissioned about around 100 or so over the time that I was the editor of that strand, which was fantastic. It was really wonderful, because you could say yes to things. And you always had a sense of the ones that would rate well, and you always needed a couple of those in your run. I mean, I had a kind of joke about what I used to call trains, planes, and automobiles, because people love watching, so something about road rage we did once, which rated incredibly well, and, things about sort of the British Transport Police. And then there were always what are called, the flashing blue lights, which are police films and, ambulance and all of that kind of stuff. And I suppose that there is an enduring interest in extreme behaviour in a way, and people who transgress. And I suppose in that it's about excitement and tension as well, and not knowing how things are going to unfold and who done it. And if you look at the parallels, I suppose, with books, those are the books that people read as well. So what is it about us humans that we're so fascinated by people who break the law and people who transgress? And is it something to do with us wondering where our own boundaries are? Or is there something about a relief that it's not you who's involved in that? I don't know. But I guess it's also a sort of adrenaline thing and an excitement.
What a perfect segue to your new career, your latest career. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What inspired the switch? Was it something you'd been thinking about for a long time?
Well, it's interesting because you see, I wouldn't see it as a switch in a way. And I think that, when I was a student, one of my favorite books was Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And it does, as you say, follow perfectly on, because one of the things that interested me about that book was the central character, Raskolnikov, who has this whole thing about murdering an old woman because he wants to step across from really the bounds of acceptable behavior into unacceptable behavior and transgress that boundary. And I think for me, the kind of films that I made were very often quite sort of psychological and were really trying to get an understanding of what made people do the things that they did. And so I had filmed quite a lot in prisons, in psychiatric hospital, in people who transgressed really in all sorts of ways, people who smuggled drugs, men who made money from women working as sex workers. And so I was always trying to sort of understand what it was that was happening in people's minds and why they were doing the things that they did. And I did spend a year filming inside Broadmoor Hospital in the UK, which is a high security psychiatric hospital. And so I've had this fascination, I guess. And I think I'd always thought that it would be interesting to work in psychotherapy. And so what happened was that during COVID, I thought, well, I can do a foundation course. I've got the time now, because things had quietened down and it wasn't really, I did have a couple of films I was working on, but it was not really getting anything new off the ground. On Zoom, I did a foundation year. And then I found myself applying to train. And so I've now just finished my first year's training and I'm now starting my clinical placements. And actually, of course, it's different. And one of the things that I've had to learn, because I think I've spent 40 years kind of, interviewing people and getting them to tell me their stories. And so what I've had to learn is that with psychotherapy, it's not so much about the story, it's more about the feelings. And that you can get lost in story, but what you need to do is go deeper than that. It's really about, helping, being alongside someone as they're trying to sort of manage themselves and trying to help them do that better.
So, what is this second post foundation, this second phase? What does that entail exactly?
The course that I'm doing is an integrative training, which means that you study the various different theories and modalities from object relations, Freud, Klein, through to humanistic and existential, Gestalt, person-centered. And out of that, you kind of formulate your own sort of personal integration of what makes sense to you and what you feel is going to be your way of working, which is obviously very much an ongoing process. And so now I have placements to work with people, which will be very heavily supervised as as a fledgling psychotherapist, as you start to find your way to being able to practice. So I have a few more years to go.
Can you see yourself returning to filmmaking?
Yeah, I don't feel I need to leave it. I feel that it's something that can happen, at the same time, actually, and that can coexist. And I won't be the first to do this. I mean, there are quite a few people. It's actually not that unusual.
Really?
Yeah, it's quite strange. But I mean, it's strange, but it's also not strange for all the reasons we've discussed.
Yeah. For documentarians, just to make sure I understand, for documentarians to go into psychotherapy.
Correct. Yes, I won't. I'm certainly not the first and won't be the last. And I think it is, this whole thing about the examined life. And that's what we do as documentary filmmakers. And also, by the way, I think not unusual the fact that I never felt that I belonged anywhere and therefore feel more comfortable as an observer in a way. I think that's also quite a sort of common trope. But yes, I think it's this sort of truth seeking, if you like, or sort of trying to discover what it's all about and what the point of it all is and how best we can do it all.
So I just want to make sure I understand correctly. I want to make sure that we understand. It's actually a very common transition to move from documentary filmmaking to practicing psychotherapy. Is that right?
I don't know how common it is. I think I'm certainly aware of a number of people that I worked with at the BBC who were documentary filmmakers who went on to train and became psychotherapists. And I think that there is a sense in which people are not that surprised by that transition, because I think there's also a lot of the same skills that you need. I think you need an intense interest in people and a curiosity about them and a kind of being alongside them and enabling them to sort of tell their stories. And then obviously, with training, that turns into helping them. Although I would like to think that also some of the films that we make do help people too.
They certainly do. They certainly do. I think a lot of people could probably name the films that have changed their thinking or maybe even changed the course of their lives. So it's a thing. Well, given these two latest chapters of your career are moving in parallel, I'll bring it back to filmmaking or documentary filmmaking. And I'll ask what you might say some of the biggest pitfalls of the industry are, or what are some of the enduring mistakes or issues that just seem to never be solved.
I think the difficulty with it, and I suppose this is true for, well, less true of some of the other creative industries actually, is that because it's expensive to make a film, there's a sense in which you're sort of always having to ask permission rather than just being able to do it. However, going back to our earlier point about the way that technology's moved, the development in technology has given people more autonomy, and actually they can get on and do it in a way that they couldn't before. Because when I started, nobody was self-shooting or self-editing, or, you were always reliant on a bunch of other people around you. These days, you can be much more of a one-man or one-woman band and do all of it yourself. However, there still is this thing that you can have a really fantastic story that you passionately believe in, and you just cannot get it made. And that is very soul-destroying. Because if you don't self-shoot and if you don't know how to edit or you don't know how to use the software, then it is really difficult. That's a big stumbling block. I mean, also, it's sometimes these things are helped because if you look at sort of people who, vanity publishing, some of those books really, you kind of feel maybe didn't need to be published. And because there's been no mediation for them, and no quality control, that can be a problem. So, it's a double-edged sword in that respect. But I think it is difficult sometimes when you just can't get interest for something that you absolutely know in your core will be good.
And it sounds like the rise of tools and the reduction in cost of both equipment and software has basically reduced, not eliminated, but reduced that hurdle.
It has reduced that, but you can then make your film and still be sort of a tree falling in the forest, because it's how you're going to get it noticed, how you're going to get it out there and get it distributed. It's a mountain to climb. And I think that, for me, certainly now at this stage, if I'm going to direct another film myself, I'm going to have to look at that mountain and think seriously about whether I want to climb it, because I know what's involved. And you really have to be so passionate about your subject to go through all the kind of shit that goes with it.
Right. Well, that's a nice segue to one of the final questions I wanted to ask, which was if we had a listener right now that was thinking of joining the field. Of course, this entire conversation has been full of advice, but is there one primary piece of advice that you might give them? This is a young, maybe not young, any person looking to become a documentarian themselves.
I think it would have to be about persistence. I think it would have to be never give up and never take no for an answer. And I remember somebody telling me early in my career about somebody who had given them advice as a young filmmaker, which was that somebody had said to them, you have to want, so if you're trying to persuade somebody, for example, to take part or, be in your film or whatever, you have to want them to do it more than they don't want to.
Right. Such good advice.
So yeah, it's about not giving up, and an enormous amount of self-belief, I think.
Yeah, and that you can see how that could be applied across a number of places. Two more questions, if I may. And I wondered if you could touch on the difference between directing, as you mentioned, directing a scripted film or a scripted episode of television versus unscripted. How common is that, first of all, to move between the two? And what did you like and what did you not like about directing a scripted episode?
It's an interesting transition to make from documentary to drama. And I think that one of the great things about drama is you've got a script, which is great because you know what's happening, you know what's going on, whereas when you're making a documentary, you've got this terrible churning uneasiness the whole time of, what the hell's going on and I can't control this, So it's fantastic to have a script, and it's also fantastic to have professionals to deliver that script to you. You're working with actors who are these wonderful creative people who can bring so much to a few lines of text and really sort of bring it alive. So that's a really fabulous and exciting experience, and a very kind of collegiate. You're all working together, and it's wonderful teamwork. So I loved that. I really enjoyed that hugely. I think that one of the things that you don't get so much is when you're making a documentary, you're really the author of that documentary. It is your work, and you are kind of creating the story as you go along, and then in the edit. And when you're directing drama, you are working with a script that already exists. So you don't have that same sense of authorship. And in drama, the script is often, in TV drama, is often sort of also, really in the kind of, it's the producer who has brought that, worked with the script editors to bring that script into being. And you then come along as director and are given this script. And obviously you can, make changes and so on. But it's a slightly different role, because it's more of a kind of, I don't know how to put it. It's like your job then is to turn that into something, but you haven't sort of given birth to it in quite the same way. So I think that's what I didn't like about it as much. I mean, unless you're the kind of, auteur director who writes their own script, and obviously then that's different, and that would probably be more fulfilling in that sense. So that was the big difference. And also with documentary, you're relying on ordinary people for the most part to give you what you need. And, they're not performers. And so it's kind of the luck of the draw, even though you're quite careful to think about who you're going to have as your contributors to your film. You are going to have those interviews that you do which are just like pulling teeth. Whereas, with an actor, you can always go, not quite right, let's go again. And you can't do that. So they are, they're very different in that sense, but it's actually really great to have experience of both, I think, because they can each inform each other. Yeah, it's a rather kind of complicated answer, but I think it is nice to move between the two, and I'm surprised that people are surprised by people who do it, if you would see what I mean, because actually it's all, as I say, it's all storytelling.
Yes, and that's the thread, and that extends to the written word as well. And it sounds like maybe not storytelling, but an interest in people and their stories, or the human condition, also informs psychotherapy, what you're doing now.
Yeah, and that's the biggest story of all, in a way, isn't it? Who are we and why are we here?
Yes. So last question I have to ask, favorite films or documentaries, perhaps of all time, those that have either informed your work or you just plain enjoy?
I always loved Michael Apted's 7 Up series, because I think of the narrative development of that. I suppose it's such a kind of body of work that's been done over so many years, and being able to see a whole life like that, in that way that we followed those people from the age of 7 up till today, I think is an extraordinary thing. And even the first one taken on its own, I remember watching, I'm the same age as those 7 Up people. And so I remember watching it when I was 7, and it was sort of unforgettable. So I liked that because it was taking a cross-section of people across different social classes and really kind of painting a picture of life in Britain at that time. And it felt like a really significant thing. There was just something about the way that was done that I think imprinted itself on me very early on. And so I tend often to like films that do have that sense of development. So for me, another film is Hoop Dreams, which again, followed people over a period of time. And I think that it was Stephen James, isn't it? I'm just trying to remember. Is it the director Stephen James?
Steve James, yes, it is.
Yeah.
And I actually I remember watching it when it first came out, being obsessed with basketball as I was, and then watched it again maybe now 5 years ago. And it's just incredible how timeless and perfect the film is.
I agree. I think Steve James is a wonderful documentarian, actually. I think he's excellent. And what I like, I think, is those very tightly focused personal narratives that speak to a much bigger story and say something kind of universal. And those are the ones that resonate with me. And that's why I think the sort of Michael Apted, Stephen James, those kinds of films are just stay with you.
2 fantastic recommendations. And for anybody who might not be aware, the Michael Apted 7 Up series, he followed a group of people every 7 years here in the UK. Is that right? And it still continues to this day.
That's correct.
So at age 7, right, and then 14 up, 21, etc.
Correct. Although sadly he died recently, but I'm sure people will still continue to do it.
Well, Olivia, I have to say thank you so much. I knew this was going to be a fascinating chat beforehand. I was really looking forward to it. It was even more fascinating and thought-provoking than I thought it would. I cannot thank you enough for your time, for your insights, for your stories, and for pulling the curtain back on really what is a fascinating and very, very, very multifaceted industry.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you about it. It's always great to be able to think about something that you just do, if you know what I mean, to be forced to kind of examine it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. It's just amazing how much interesting knowledge and experience is out there, but it's also overwhelming. That's what's behind Fate v Future. It's a 5-minute email designed to make reading about business, culture, media, marketing, luxury, travel, and more faster and even more fun than it otherwise would be. Readers tell me that Fate v. Future helps them stay on top of things like nothing else they've ever read. Really, and that has real-world business benefits. One reader said it leaves him trade show ready, meaning each 5-minute issue is full of enough interesting things to have a conversation with anyone he meets at a conference. I love that, because the whole idea behind the email is to give you the interesting insights, innovations, and information that will let you own your future. Subscribe to my email newsletter at 10xsmarter.com. That's 10xsmarter.com. I'm John Callis. Thank you for listening.